Today I'd like to talk to you about how we can make blue light safe again. I'm Scott Zimmerman, CEO of Silas, Inc. I've been in the area of lighting for over 30 years with over 85 patents in the area of optics, displays, and lighting. Many of you are probably aware of the concerns associated with blue light hazards. It's been showing up through numerous different groups. The American Medical Association has issued warnings about LED lighting. Studies done for Harvard Medical have linked increased levels of breast cancer to outdoor lighting. Corning and other companies are introducing a number of new products to try and reduce the amount of blue that we are exposed to from our devices, displays, and iPhones. And then in general, there's an epidemic of myopia over in Asia in particular that is associated with mainly the youth, with up to 90% of the kids now having nearsightedness, which doesn't bode well for their long-term impacts of macular degeneration. And they're finding that the exposure to natural lighting is one possible way to mitigate the problem. I'd like to start our conversation with a definition of terms so that we're all on the same page. Typically, the technical definition of light is from 400 to 700 nanometers, or the visible spectrum. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'd like us to deal with the wavelength range that's associated with light as it impacts us on the surface of the Earth. That typically runs from about 250 nanometers out to 2250, giving a spectral range of about 2000 nanometers. That, as shown in the black line. That can be divided into four main areas: UV, which is associated with 250 to 400 nanometers typically, and provides for vitamin D production and sets our circadians. And of course, then they have the visible range, which is provides us with the ability to see for those of us who've been blessed enough to good eyesight. And then you're followed by the near infrared and the IR, which represents the largest portion of the energy that impinges on our body. The near infrared in particular being fairly unique in that a biological window exists where most organic materials and a number of inorganic materials for that matter exhibit very low absorption. This allows for deep penetration into our body. The infrared is unique as well in that is dominated by water absorption, and at that wavelength range all of us are equal. We are basically black skin with white hair. As you can see on the graph, the sun is something that we've been underneath for millions of years. Our bodies have evolved and adapted to use that with these various wavelengths. And you can see also that the filament sources or incandescents are plotted by the dashed black line, and then the just visible, or as I like to call it, JV lighting from CFLs and LEDs over the last 30 years has basically focused most of their energy in the visible. So based on what we did with the previous graph, it's possible now to plot the spectral content as a function of history. So the blue line is just that. And if you look at the upper left-hand corner, back in the 1800s, the majority of us were using sunlight, fire, candles, which has spectral content of about 2000 nanometers. Starting in the latter part of the 1800s, the incandescent bulb was brought out by Edison and others, which, while it generated copious amounts of near-infrared and IR, it struggled to generate enough visible and definitely had difficulties with UV and blue, so the spectral content dropped to about 1600 nanometers. In the 1960s, we had a radical change associated with fluorescence, where, as I would call it, just visible or JV lighting. The fluorescent has about 300 nanometers of spectral content, did reinduce a little bit of blue and UV, but in general radically changed how much spectral content we were provided in our artificial environment. About 10 to 15 years ago, the LED began to dominate, And we're mostly starting with the blue and a phosphor combination, which has about 220 nanometers of spectral content. And then we're seeing, especially in displays, LED, RGB, which has about 150 nanometers, and even quantum dot things that are quantum dot versions that have even narrower spectral content. Eventually, if we ever get lasers involved, then you're looking at only a few nanometers of spectral content within our displays and our lighting. Also plotted on the graph is some curves associated with various ailments. Starting here with the green one. Back in the 1950s, about 20% of the population suffered from myopia or nearsightedness. And then we saw a rapid increase till present day where, especially in Asian countries, 90% of the population has nearsightedness. In fact, they call it a myopia epidemic. What's really troubling is this is mainly among young children, not the older population. And it does not bode well for their situation as far as macular degeneration and other ailments with the eye. Also graphed in the purple one is the percent increase of skin cancer among white males. You can see a rapid increase despite the fact that we are spending less time outside and we are being encouraged to use sunscreen and other methods to try and reduce the amount of UV exposure. Autism is also graphed, associated with the increased recognition of autism in our youth. There has been a linkage done between autism and flicker associated with fluorescence, but there may be other things too. Also, one of the things that we need to think about is that dementia is also on the rise, especially among various ethnic groups. Given all the studies, daylighting studies and natural light studies that are showing everything from enhanced learning to improved health, would appear to be useful to look at how is natural sunlight different from just visible LED lighting or JV LED lighting. And so in the graph here, I've tried to kind of give you a representation of what actually happens out in the real world. So you start with the spectrum of the sun, and as we stated earlier, the near-infrared to visible ratio is greater than 1. And then what happens is that the light that actually enters our eyes, majority of it actually is reflected off into something else. We don't spend much time looking directly at the sun. So if you look on the right, you see the top, you see a reflectivity of green leaves. One thing you notice is that in order for us to see color, the things that are reflecting the light off of them have to actually remove visible parts of the visible spectrum. So the green leaves have very low reflectivity to blue and red, and about 20 to 30% reflectivity in the green spectrum. But they have very high reflectivity in the near infrared. So when the sunlight hits the leaves and bounces in towards our eyes, the spectrum that actually enters or goes to our eyes can be shown in the middle graph, which is predominantly near infrared, and the near infrared to visible ratio becomes greater than 5. Now, one of the things that people aren't typically aware of is that the eye is actually both an imaging and a non-imaging element, in that the part that enters through the pupil is imaged on the retina, but more than 90% of the light that actually enters the eye doesn't even go through the pupil. The sclera and the eyelids are both highly transmissive to near-infrared and scattering. So majority of the near-infrared, which is the dominant wavelengths that's actually coming at the eye after the transformation we went through, scatters into the retina or into the eye and floods the inside of the eye with copious amounts of near-infrared. So what ends up going into your eyes in the bottom with a near-infrared to visible greater than 30, and I'd add that for a blue light source, it's actually a near-infrared to visible ratio greater than 300. So the point of this is that what actually happens in nature is that the eye collects an excess of near-infrared, and as we know from numerous medical studies, near-infrared stimulates ATP and repairs damage. And so you can say that nature basically is preloading the eye with a bunch of near-infrared, especially for the purpose of repairing the damage done for UV and blue photons. Unfortunately, with just visible LED lighting, they emit zero near-infrared, so this is not available for the body to use for its own natural defenses. What we now know is that JV lighting is not harmful because of what it emits, but because of what it omits. As you can see in the two graphs, the blue that comes from a JV LED lighting or display is entirely different than what a blue that's in nature. And what we now know based on the medical community's work is that near-infrared is an integral part of our body's natural defenses and necessary for our body to protect itself from the higher harmful rays associated with UV, violet, blue, and even green. In talking about light, a lot of times it's useful to look at the photons and get a count of what's actually coming into your eye or on your skin, and I've done it here for a 10-hour period. And you can see that there's an extreme amount of photons that are actually delivered to the eye, both in the near-infrared and blue spectrum. In the case of sunlight, as we showed earlier, there's this amplification effect where the amount of near-infrared photons exceeds the amount of blue photons by orders of magnitude. If you go into an office that has windows, but it's got LED lighting, what you'll see is that ratio is reversed, where now blue is the dominant and near-infrared is much lower and in fact deficient, not providing what the other case, the case where it's actually protecting us against the effects of the blue. Now, of course, in offices nowadays, a lot of people are using near-infrared filtering to save energy, which essentially blocks any near-infrared from coming in through windows, or people are in office spaces that have no windows. And in that particular case, you have no near-infrared, but you still have a lot of blue coming from your various lighting and displays. You can even go to the point of calculating what the number of photons entering the eye are for a computer display in a dark room or at nighttime. And you're still looking at 10 to the 16th photons of blue. So this kind of comes to play about the futility of trying to actually reduce the blue concentration with any real means. I mean, even if you put a filter on that knocks it down by, to less than 1%, you're still dealing with millions and millions of interactions of photons with the eye. The retina has approximately 100 million photoreceptors. So you're literally talking about millions of interactions in a 10-hour period. So it's not just your eye, but also your skin and your skull that is impacted by near-infrared significantly. What you see here is two ray traces, one associated with someone with very dark skin, with high melanin levels, someone with very light skin. What you can see is in both cases, the photons, the near-infrared photons, tend to propagate deeply into the body, up to 1.5 inches. That's independent of whether or not you're dealing with muscles or where you're dealing with even the brain. So what it shows is that it's probably important for us to think about lighting and optimizing it based on the person's particular physical needs. What has happened in people who are have very high melanin levels, they evolved in a situation where there was a lot of sun and a lot of UV, and they have developed the ability to deal with that with high absorption in the first 100 microns of their skin, making them 10 times less susceptible to skin cancer as someone with light skin, but also more susceptible to near-infrared deficiencies. That seems to correlate fairly well with dementia rates being so much higher among African Americans and other ethnic groups that have been displaced in latitude. And it also correlates with the other way, where skin cancer rates among white, fair-skinned people who've moved to regions in which there are high incidence levels, like close to the equator, will have much higher, up to 10 times more higher skin cancer problems. The photo on the right is kind of an illustration of what's going on in the near-infrared. The reason that you can see the veins on the woman's legs is because there's very low absorption for most of the tissue, but very high absorption to the hemoglobin in the blood. While these veins are visible here, they're not visible and cannot be seen in the visible spectrum. And the same thing is true of the apple picture below. In the visible, it looks like a nice apple, but in the near infrared, you see defects or see damaged cells. This is a unique thing about the near infrared because the absorption levels are so low for the majority of the cell structures. Any type of damaged area or area in which there is increased blood flow, like around cancer cells, will actually tend to get more of the near infrared absorbed in them because the light, as you can see from the ray tracing, light bounces around significantly until it finds a place to actually get absorbed. So in some sense, there is an additional level of magnification or preferential deposition of near infrared to those areas which are damaged or having some kind of an issue like cancer cells. So why is just visible or JV LED lighting so bad for us? Well, I think that I'd like to make the argument that our body, we fail to take into account that our body has developed a very unique set of natural defenses associated with either sacrifice, repair, or replace, or a combination of any of the above. As you can see from the normal skin model that's there, the epidermis has essentially taken on the role of being a sacrificial layer. Every 10 to 30 days, the epidermis is essentially replaced, and that is the region where the majority, if not all, the UV blue is absorbed in that first 100 microns or so of thickness. The purpose of this sacrificial layer is to protect the underlying cells. Unlike the epidermis, which is rapidly replenished and replaced, the underlying cells, fat, neural, muscle cells, brain cells, and even the retina can be replaced, only are replaced every 5 to 15 years, or actually in some cases are never replaced. And once you lose them, they're gone. Now, this illustrates that because of the unique nature of the absorption characteristics and scatter characteristics of the skin and the eye, near infrared is, in a lot of cases, is the only light that the majority of our cells, a lot of these cells, ever see. Now, what we do know from the medical industry, and there's over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers in this area, what actually happens in the near infrared, or one of the main functions of near infrared in our body, is to stimulate ATP production within the mitochondria. Now, all cells in the body have mitochondria except for a couple. And the point of that process is to essentially stimulate regeneration, growth, and what we're seeing is that there's an important aspect to how our body protects itself and in one of its major natural defenses. So if we accept the premise that we need to reintroduce near infrared back into our artificial lighting, the question is, how do we do it? So I'd like to present what I call the Goldilocks analogy. And it starts with the premise that natural sunlight is our human-centric lighting baseline. If you look at natural lighting, our natural sunlight, you'll see that it has a near IR to visible ratio greater than 1, and a near IR to blue ratio greater than 10, and it being essentially the baseline against which we should be actually comparing. This is supported by numerous daylight studies that show everything from enhanced learning capability for children in natural lighting compared to artificial lighting, and numerous other elements that benefit from the use of natural lighting compared to especially just visible LED lighting. So in the first case, something that's been around for centuries is what I'd call too hot, which is incandescent, which has a near infrared to visible ratio greater than 10 and near infrared to blue greater than 100, making it blue deficient and have an excess amount of near infrared and IR, which will essentially waste energy and doesn't provide us with what we need as far as circadian type stimulus. They say this is compared to what I call the too cold solution, which is just visible or JV LED lighting and displays, which inherently has a near IR to visible and near IR to blue ratios equal to 0, because they have 0 near infrared and IR available to benefit our body. These tend to be expensive solutions due to the complexity of the drive conditions. They have medium reliability, and they end up using a significant amount of raw materials associated with mainly the electronics necessary to drive these particular type of displays, or the displays and light sources. What I would suggest is that the just right solution is, of course, Silas's near-infrared enhanced LED lights and displays. They're characterized with a near IR to visible ratio greater than 1 and a near IR to blue ratio greater than 10, which matches sunlight. It saves energy, as it provides us with the near-infrared protection that we need. It has higher reliability than even the LED solutions. It's cheaper and uses significantly less raw materials because of the simplification of the whole design. The Silas near-infrared enhanced LED lighting is a hybrid design. It basically takes advantage of the best parts of the filament along with the best parts of the LED. As you can see, by properly combining filaments and LEDs, you can get a very much improved IV response, as shown in the upper left-hand graph. Start out, goes from 0 up to 15 volts. At low voltages, the spectral content output is dominated by the filaments and have a beautiful orange-red coloration. And as you increase the voltages, the LED can become the dominant output, driving it from this beautiful sunset all the way up to midday daylight. And then you can set the amount of near-infrared to visible ratio depending on how you pick the filaments to go with the LED itself. One of the big issues associated with just visible LEDs is the problematic IV curve. As you can see at the lower left, there is a turn-on voltage, and then there is a very rapid increase in current as a function of voltage. This requires you to use extensive amount of circuitry to compensate for this rapid change and use things like constant current drivers. By combining it with the basic circuit that's shown similar to the circuit that's shown up in the upper right, you can correct this problem and make something that not only has a very gentle IV curve where voltage dimming is a possibility, but it also naturally matches what happens with the sun. As you drop the voltage, the intensity and the color shifts as you would expect in a sunset. You can see in the lower right-hand corner the components that are typically used. You'll notice that the filaments themselves are very small. Does not take much in the way of filament bulbs because the LED or the filaments are so efficient at generating near infrared, and we're only trying to match the amount of near infrared to the amount of optical watts of visible. So in this particular case, the drive characteristics of the filaments are low, and they are actually the higher reliability component in this design. So much so that we had to actually come up with a much higher reliability connection system for the LEDs. That's associated with the carbon nanotube yards, and essentially taking the failure mechanism associated with electromigration and stress migration out of the equation. In this particular case, the carbon nanotube yards are essentially glued onto the diodes themselves, and you can either use these as freestanding filaments or you can use them with additional heat sinking means to pull the heat out of the LEDs if necessary. Because of the way the structures or the circuit is actually put together, the filaments themselves are the high reliability with multiple million hour lifetimes expected compared to the LEDs, and so that you end up with a minimal amount of material, a very simple drive characteristics, greatly reducing the amount of extra components necessary compared to JV LED lighting. As you can see in the picture, the light transitions from a beautiful sunset up to a full daylight, and then transitions on back down, changing from the bright white down to the orange. The construction is very simple, consisting of basically two parts, and as you can see, the carbon nanotube yarns are very effective at providing power to the LED. Based on the understanding above, Silas has been able to develop a fairly large intellectual platform that we are presently licensing out to several companies. At the core is, of course, the near-infrared enhanced LED lighting, but also you'll see that there's a significant IP associated with enhancing near-infrared for displays. As we stated earlier, the amount of blue interaction is so high that it is somewhat unrealistic to think that you can just filter out and have a significant impact, given the fact that the number of interactions of blue photons with the eye and other structures. There's also intellectual property associated with doing exposure apps, basically trying to determine the optimum lighting profile for you on a day, weekly, and monthly basis. Near-infrared medical devices. It's also possible near-infrared has a very high transmittance through most clothing. It's possible to actually select clothing that has more optimum near-infrared transmittance and provide people with a little bit more near-infrared content. As we discussed earlier, there is a significant difference in how people respond to lighting based on their skin coloration. Therefore, user-specific lighting is covered in the filings as well. And then the final component being, of course, the solder-free carbon nanotube yarn interconnects, which are used to increase the reliability of LEDs so that they can compete or match up with that of the filaments themselves. In general, the Silas technology is applicable to lighting, displays, sportswear, software, electronic packaging, and healthcare markets. Our business model is to provide a series of non-exclusive licenses across multiple business areas to get the products out there for the general public. So hopefully I've been able to convince you that it's important for us to reintroduce near-infrared into our artificial lighting systems. The question is, how could you maybe help? One thing, of course, is you can support Silas and Silas's licensees. In particular, an interesting story associated with one of our licensees, Aerotech light bulb company. Aerotech was the last incandescent manufacturer in the United States. Unfortunately, in 2015, they had to shut their facilities. They had gotten permission from the DOE to allow them to continue to make incandescent bulbs, but unfortunately, the Chinese at that point made it impossible or would refuse to sell them the raw materials necessary for the continual operation, so they were forced to shut down. That's why it's so important that we introduce technology and bring manufacturing back to the United States. The other thing you do is ask your employer to consider the benefits of near-infrared enhanced lighting. Just a 1% increase in productivity more than dwarfs the cost savings associated, or energy cost savings associated with lighting in general. Push the DOE to rethink the JV LED lighting approach. Presently, some of their rebate programs and requirements are limiting the ability for companies such as ourselves to innovate and provide the public with healthier lighting solutions. And then lastly, become more aware of what near-infrared impacts your health. Below are some more keywords that you might want to search on. There's a lot of information out there that provides you with all kinds of useful information in how to improve your health through the use of near-infrared. If nothing else, go for a walk in the park or sit down in front of a fireplace with your significant other.